Well, hi, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Mark Graven. Our guest today is Tobias Gilk, the founder of Gilk Radiology Consulting. He is, and we're going to learn a lot more about him and his work here, but he is an architect by training, but he spent more than 20 years focusing on MRI safety in healthcare, of course, initially through the architecture and planning of MRI facilities, but then quickly growing into the technology, clinical practice, regulation, and economics of MRI safety. He's recognized by state and federal courts as an expert in MRI safety issues. He's published dozens of papers and articles on MRI safety. He's also twice a member of the American College of Radiology's MRI Safety Committee and twice named co-author of the ACR MCI Safety Standard Guidance. So, Toby, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Thank you very much. I'm doing great. How are you?
I am doing really well. I'm excited that we can talk here today. I know your name. Followed your LinkedIn posts a long time through a mutual friend, Dave Broncart, ePatient Dave. So I'll give him credit for sharing and liking and commenting on all the things you've shared. How do you know ePatient Dave?
Um, well, the patient advocate domain of folks who are interested in patient safety and more than just interested in it, influential in patient safety, that's a very small list. And um, e-patient Dave is a force of nature. Dave is amazing.
Yeah.
And I have, ever since I became aware of him, oh goodness, what would that be? Maybe 10 years ago or so. I've just tried to follow him because I'm always impressed with his positive approach to, identifying and then addressing problems in the healthcare arena. And I've taken that a little bit as an inspiration for my
Mm,
own work. I know that generally speaking, what he focuses on and what I focus on, the Venn diagrams of those two things don't really overlap other than they're both in healthcare.
mhm.
Um, but I'm so appreciative of number one, a patient voice, and number two, his let's work the problem approach to everything.
Yeah, yeah. And I met Dave he was invited to sit in on some lean training that I was doing for a hospital at Boston, and we realized the Venn diagram of things we care about. There's a lot of overlap, and for the episode here today, for those listening, I mean, this is the Lean Blog Interviews podcast. I don't know if the word lean is going to come up again the rest of the discussion, and as far as I'm concerned, that's fine. But I think part of the overlap of the work that you do, Toby, and what I'm interested in talking about today and sharing with the listener is themes of patient safety, talking about process, talking about prevention. How do we learn and help ensure the safest possible environment for patients, well, and staff. I should make sure it's also about staff safety, and it's a great chance to pick your brain on all of that, Toby. But I'm curious before, and maybe this is part of the story of how you got in to this work. I want to hear about that and the issues that you've learned about and help people address. But for those that aren't really familiar, or those of us who barely know what MRI stands for, could you give us kind of a quick technology overview of the technology and what about it creates risk to staff
Sure.
and patients?
So I became enamored of MRI technology because I think it's the closest thing to magic that human beings have ever built.
Mm,
MRI machines are just phenomenally interesting. So the basics of MRI is we put you in a high strength magnetic field, and then we thump you with additional applied time varying magnetic fields that we sort of send these pulses of magnetism at you. And the combination of the high strength, always on magnetic field plus these magnetic field pulses that we
mm,
send allows us to collect signal from whatever's in the middle of the MRI scanner, right? And through very sophisticated computers, we can take the cacophony of signal that comes out of your tissues, and we can slice it and dice it and wind up producing pictures. Well, that's great. We can do, we can come up with pictures if we're doing X-rays, right? So why is MRI different from doing an X-ray or a CT, which is essentially just a whole bunch of X-rays stitched together by a computer?
Mhm.
What makes MRI really interesting is that it's looking at the emitted signal of each molecule, and
Mhm.
each molecule, like spectroscopy, right? We can filter the light from a distant star through a spectroscope, and we can identify what the chemical composition of that star is, right? MRI is very similar in that because we're looking at signal that originates from each and every molecule, we can essentially chemically fingerprint the materials that are giving off signal, which means if you have a brain tumor, for example, in many cases, the brain tumor is essentially just sort of the brain's own tissue that has gone haywire in reproduction, right?
Mhm.
So if you took an X-ray of it, how is the X-ray or the CT going to differentiate between brain tissue and crazy reproducing brain tissue because they're the same thing, right?
Mhm.
Except crazy reproducing brain tissue has a slightly different chemical signature.
Mhm.
And so if we can image based on the chemical fingerprint of individual molecules, we can begin to differentiate, hey, wait a second, no, that's the unhealthy tissue. That's the healthy tissue.
Mhm.
And so we can make differentiations primarily where some of the greatest benefit of MRI comes from is in soft tissue differentiation.
Mhm.
So we see MRI used an awful lot for brain imaging, soft tissue differentiation, but it also has uses everywhere else. It's amazing for inflammation and cartilage and other non-bony tissues, being able to identify. So we're finding applications for MRI, all throughout the body, all different anatomical regions and disease processes and that sort of thing. It's absolutely fascinating. And if you want to geek out like I do, on sort of the physics behind all of this,
Mhm.
it's mind-blowing science. Like I
Mhm.
say, closest thing to magic I think human beings have ever built.
Mhm. And so it's a technology that doesn't expose the patient or the operator of the MRI to the same type of radiation that we would be exposed to by X-ray. Is that correct?
Right. So X-ray radiation, and again, X-rays are used in CT scanners, and
Mhm.
then there's nuclear medicine where we're using radioactive isotopes. That whole grouping of imaging technologies utilize what's called ionizing radiation.
Mhm.
Ionizing radiation is what can cause damage to cellular reproduction, right? MRI uses magnetism. Magnetism is non-ionizing radiation, right? Still electromagnetic radiation, just as X-rays are electromagnetic radiation, but based on where it falls in the electromagnetic spectrum, magnetism doesn't have enough energy to cause the chromosomal damage that can lead to crazy reproduction, cancers, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So when MRI first came about clinically 40 years ago, plus or minus, we were very concerned with ionizing radiation. We were really beginning to kind of wrap our arms around what the effects of medical levels of radiation exposure were. And we had concerns about that. And at that time, MRI comes upon the scene and MRI says, hey, guys, I know you're worried about this ionizing radiation
Yeah.
thing. Guess what? We invented an entirely new imaging modality that doesn't use ionizing radiation. So the thing that you're worried about, this doesn't have at all.
Mhm.
And everybody was like, that's fantastic. Let's use MRI. The, the problem is that in the moment, I don't think anybody asked the follow-on question, which to my mind is, Well, if you don't have the risks that we've been historically worried about, do you have any new or different risks that we should be aware of, that we
Right.
should prospectively respond to? That part of the question was never really asked, has to date never been asked in a regulatory or licensure framework.
Mm.
MRI came into the world with the marketing or PR slogan of the safe modality, and has really sort of ridden that PR campaign all the way up into the future. Now, generally speaking, MRIs can be extraordinarily safe, right? We have professionally identified what the risks are and what the best practices are to mitigate those risks.
Mhm.
Um, MRIs generate extremely powerful magnetic fields, and anybody who spends 15 minutes on Google can find all kinds of, amazing and laugh and point and giggle kind of questions, photos of things that have gone flying at MRI
Well,
scanners.
those photos beg a lot of questions then, and we'll get into all of that. But
Yes. Um, and projectile accidents are indeed one of the most significant risks in the MRI environment. Now, obviously, if we just screen things and people before they go into the room, or we make things out of metals for the MRI suite that don't go flying, we can effectively manage those risks. But projectile risks are not the only ones. The magnetism, whether it's the always-on magnetic field or the extra applied magnetic fields that happen during imaging, they can interfere with implants and medical devices, right? So we might cause your pacemaker or your implanted insulin pump to malfunction. And that malfunctioning pacemaker or insulin pump or other device might cause you harm as a result of the fact that it had this negative interaction with the MRI scanner. The energies that we superimpose on the always on magnetic field, also, all of that stuff winds up getting converted into heat inside your body. If you've ever had an MRI, a lot of times you'll start out feeling like, the room that they put the MRI in is a meat locker, right? It's
yeah,
just so cold when you walk in there.
they
But
throw a
by the time
blanket
you're
on
done
you.
with your MRI scanner, you swear to God that somebody just sort of dialed the thermostat up, 20 degrees. The room temperature is exactly the same. The thing is that the MRI procedure inputs energy into your body, and that energy gets converted into heat.
Mhm.
Now, generally speaking, it's diffused, right? You come out feeling warm or maybe even sweaty, uncomfortably hot, but not harmed.
Mhm.
But there are certain mechanisms by which the thermal energy that gets put into your body winds up getting focused or concentrated into small areas instead of broadly sprinkled over your
Uh,
body, and then we can actually produce burns.
would, would
And
would would that be a machine malfunction or a mistake in how it's set up to cause that
so
burn?
there are MRI machine malfunctions, but they are so vanishingly rare
Mhm.
that in any big picture conversation of MRI safety, they're almost not even worth raising, right?
Sure.
In 99% of the MRI accidents, it involves the failure to identify a potential contraindication, right? The patient had something with them, in them, on them that made this, potential risk come into being, right? Or we failed to effectively position the patient or pad the patient, just as one example. And there are a few different ways that we can actually wind up producing a burn in an MRI. But one of the more common ways is the transmitters of some of that radio frequency electromagnetic energy actually are behind the walls of the tube. And when you are really, really close to the transmitter, um, it actually behaves something like a microwave oven.
Hmm.
There's what's called a dipole-dipole interaction. It excites water molecules, and the water molecules can heat up.
Well, there's our
So
body. Yeah.
in most MRI scanners, the manufacturer, the Siemenses, the GEs, the Philips, the Canons of the world, they say, you know what? When you slide the patient in, just make sure that they're not right next to the walls of the tube.
Mm.
right?
Mhm.
If it's a skinny person, great, just have them keep their arms close to their torso. If it's a bigger person, right, put some padding in there and just make sure they don't get too close.
Mhm.
Because if your shoulders or your elbows or whatever get too close to the walls of the tube,
Mm.
those might get a disproportionate amount of the energy, the electromagnetic energy, and
Mhm.
it may be it may be close enough where it's acting like a microwave, right? And it
Mm.
cooks some of the water
Sure.
under your skin.
Mhm.
So we understand the overwhelming majority of how these accidents occur. We understand the mechanics of how injury is produced, right?
Right.
And as a result, we can look to existing best practices and say, this best practice interrupts this pathway of causation, right? This blocks off one of the Swiss cheese layers if we do this, right? The problem is that those best practices are not mandatory.
Mm.
They're not requirements. So the US FDA, they only regulate point of care for one radiology device,
Mhm.
mammography. In the United States, it literally takes an act of Congress to get the FDA to regulate point of care safety. And through Mammography Quality and Standards Act, the US government essentially gave the FDA power to regulate point of care for mammography. They have not received
Mhm.
authority to regulate point of care for any other radiologic imaging
Mhm.
device.
Mhm.
So the FDA doesn't regulate it nationally. States largely have bought into the MRI is the safe modality,
Yeah.
and therefore we don't need to regulate it mindset.
Mhm.
And the regulator, excuse me, the accrediting organizations, by and large, have kind of been hands off, laissez faire about the whole thing.
Mhm.
So it comes down to the individual provider for the overwhelming majority of the preventions as to whether they
Mhm.
want to do it or not.
So what I hear you saying is the equipment in and of itself could be generally considered safe, but there could be process problems. I mean, I think of times when I've had a lower back MRI, I was asked questions. There was a checklist that would seem to be one of the procedural things to make sure that I didn't have any metallic implants or didn't have any heavy metal objects with me.
Right.
In Texas, I mean, I don't carry a gun, but it seems like they need to very, very strictly screen and make sure that somebody realizes they can't bring their gun near the MRI, right? I mean, there are process problems that could lead to harm. And I'm thinking I've learned something here about that heat impact. I was thinking mostly of these dramatic photos of items being sucked into, and I know it's not suction, but pulled, drawn into the
Right.
magnet, which could be, I mean, I think there have been cases of guns, like maybe a security guard or police officer has a gun, metallic poles, beds, other items like that.
Right.
Could you share some of those examples, or at least kind of like a typical case study of the danger of, a metallic object being pulled into the magnet?
Sure. Um, there just a few weeks ago, there was a case made public. I think it happened last year of a woman who went into an MRI scanner with a concealed firearm,
Mm.
and the magnet pulled the pistol from her.
Hmm.
Um, and there really isn't enough detail to understand the magnetism can act on the inner workings, the mechanics of the firing of a pistol. And
Mm.
so the magnetism can actually force the pistol to fire,
Hmm.
or it can go flying and it can, hit the face of the MRI scanner, and that impact or shock can
Hmm.
cause it to discharge around. So we
Hmm.
don't know exactly what the mechanisms were of it, discharging around, but it actually shoots the woman in the butt, shoots her through the
Jeez.
buttock,
Mm.
um, you know, which I laugh because the only other alternative is to cry. That we have these process breakdowns that allow these kinds of accidents to occur. Um, several months prior, another pistol, not in the United States this time, but this was in Brazil. A man who I believe was accompanying his mother or his mother-in-law into the MRI room, fills out the screening form. No, I don't have any metal. Walks in, has a concealed pistol, goes flying, shoots him in the back, and he winds up dying of the injuries. But pistols are far and away, not the only thing that goes flying. There was a case last year of a hospital in California where an ICU nurse brought the ICU bed with the patient on top into the MRI scanner. And then the MRI scanner is sitting at one end of the room and the nurse is coming in with the bed. And when you cross the magic threshold, the magnet is going to grab the bed and it slams the bed against the MRI. The only thing was the nurse was in between. The nurse winds up getting pinned between the bed and the magnet. And she suffered some pretty extensive injuries as a result of that. So each of these incidents are ones where, there is an inherent risk created by the machine and the electromagnetic fields that the machine generates, right? Not because the machine is malfunctioning, quite the opposite, because the machine is functioning exactly the way it's designed to, right? It's generating these electromagnetic fields. If we, as you pointed out, if we do the process, the prospective risk management process before we bring the people or the equipment material into the room, right? We know what the risks are. We know how to manage these risks. We just don't do them uniformly. The two pistol accidents, both of those purportedly were ones where the site gave instructions to the patient or the visitor, saying, no metal is allowed in that room, but relied on, patient disclosure. Yes, I do. No, I don't.
I mean, I can't go into, sorry to interrupt, I can't go into a sporting event without walking through a magnetometer to check to see if I have a gun or a weapon.
Exactly. And there are specially designed, they call them ferromagnetic detectors. They are specifically designed to screen for the types of metal that go flying into MRI scanners, right? Which is great because we don't want alerts or alarms on titanium or aluminum or things that aren't going to be attracted to the MRI, things from which we make a bunch of the stuff that lives in MRI suites, right? But we do want to catch the ICU beds and the pistols and cell phones and God knows what else. So they do have these ferromagnetic detectors. At the hospital where the ICU bed went in, they actually had them. And after the accident occurred, the hospital biomedical engineering department went in and tested them to make sure that they were working as they were supposed to. And they found, sure enough, thumbs up, they're working, which means either the MRI department staff turned them off, or they just were so inured to the alarms that they didn't use them as a feedback tool to tell them you're about to make the worst professional decision you've ever made in your life.
Yeah, is there a scenario? I mean, alarm fatigue is discussed a lot in healthcare and probably in other workplaces where people turn off the alarm and they get away with it for a while until something bad happens. Are there times when something verging on a false alarm of, let's say, a small piece of metal sets off the alarm, people get frustrated and like, oh, you know what, that would, like, do they just get kind of lax, do you think, until then, sadly, the big piece of metal that you would have wanted to catch does get through?
Yes, that does happen. And that is in my mind, that's symptomatic of a less than ideal approach to a feedback tool, right?
Right.
Lots of sites that have had ferromagnetic detection for MRI pre-screening. Somebody essentially shows up, attorneys or the risk management department, or somebody shows up on Monday and says, we bought this new thing, we're putting it up here. it'll go beep when something with magnetic metal walks through it, right? And that's kind of the whole story that the staff winds up getting, right?
That,
And sure enough, you walk through or you approach the
yeah.
thing, you walk through the detector and it goes beep, right? Well, if that was the beginning, middle, and end of the here's the tool and here's how to use it explanation, absolutely, that's going to lead to alarm fatigue.
Or,
Um,
or I mean, I think there's also a lesson to be learned around change management if that's how the new tool is being introduced, instead of more fully engaging people and understanding the problem and how this is a countermeasure. And so, to me, there's adjacent to process problems are often training or communication issues.
right. So the sites that take that exact same tool in the exact same position and look at it as this is a feedback tool. This is a device to tell us whether all of the things that we think that we're doing effectively and efficiently upstream, right? That we're divorcing our patients and our personnel from the things that can go flying, right? That's why you have changing rooms, right? That's why we go through this pre-screening process. All of that is essentially geared towards getting to the doorway into the MRI room and being perfectly ready to go in there, right?
Hmm.
So if the thing at the doorway alarms, if it goes beep, right, what that should be telling you is not that the thing went beep. What that should be telling you is, hey, wait a second, all of the 2 or 3 or 10 or 20 processes that we set to make sure this thing doesn't go beep when the patient arrives, somewhere in that list of precursor steps, we didn't do something the way we thought we were going to do.
Right.
Right. And as soon as you start using the machine that goes beep as a feedback tool for your preparation process,
Mhm.
now all of a sudden it becomes an extraordinarily valuable safety tool.
Right.
So it's not the tool as much as it is your willingness to integrate the tool into the process.
Right. And so, and I'll point people in the show notes to your LinkedIn page, Toby, and videos and things that you post. It's been very helpful, education for me. And it seems like one of the key risk factors that we need to have good countermeasures for, as you've already touched on, is access control, varying spaces nearest, different zones. Is that the right way to say it? Nearest to the MRI and kind of further back where you might have access control. And we're recording this almost a week after the runway incursion. This is going to sound like I'm totally changing topics, but I think there's parallels here. The runway incursion at the Tokyo Haneda Airport, Japanese Coast Guard plane was told to taxi and hold, don't enter the runway, you're not cleared for takeoff. For reasons yet unknown, here on January 8th, that plane ended up on the runway and was hit by a landing JAL Airbus. And so, I've talked to a pilot friend of mine and reading the news reports around just, access control. And the access controls aren't as strict as they maybe could be, right? Physical barriers, lights that were stoplights that weren't operational at the moment. And so whether it's, this question of like, well, who isn't keeping their eyeballs, paying someone to keep their eyeballs on every single plane versus a hospital, like kind of brute forcing it without technology, of like paying someone who's trained well enough to screen the people and items and materials. It seems like even without an elegant technology solution, like why couldn't you just brute force that to prevent? And I'm not saying attack, for using force against people, but using the clumsy, even just costly, labor-intensive solution. If patient safety is always our top priority, as hospitals like to say, why are these? I think I'm finally getting around to a question. I got up on my soapbox. Why aren't best practices followed, yet alone made mandatory? If it's a choice, why is that choice not made?
That's the $64,000 question right there. So one of the challenges is if we look over the last 20, 30 years, what a hospital gets paid for performing one MRI today is probably a fifth, a tenth of what it was 20, 25 years ago, right? 25 years ago, MRI was this ivory tower kind of medical procedure. And I guess the negotiating power that hospitals had with the insurance companies was far greater because there was a limited supply of them. And so, they were making bank off of MRI services. And then huge proliferation of outpatient imaging centers. Essentially, the market gets saturated. And insurance companies now have the negotiating power. And like I say, rates today, just in terms of straight dollars, not adjusted for inflation or anything like that, are probably 1/5 to 1/10 of what they were, 25 years ago. So there has been this massive squeeze in terms of cost control of MRI services and staffing. Once you take your $1.5 million cost of the MRI scanner and your $500,000 cost for the specialty construction of an MRI suite, right? You've got all of this fixed cost. Your number one variable cost is staffing. And so two things simultaneously happened. One, we wanted to reduce staffing costs, which meant either fewer bodies or less experienced, lower on the wage scale, individuals, or some combination of those two things. Plus, we want to try and accelerate the number of patients that we put through the machine, right? If we get paid on a per patient per exam basis, we do more exams, we're going to make more money, right? So simultaneously, we see a reduction in workforce, both experience and just the numbers of individuals sort of, put to task for this. And we have much greater throughput demands. And the role of the MRI technologist is not just simply to sit back there and, play Sudoku and hit the go button, every 4 minutes. They're also doing lookups for the next patient and juggling schedules because this patient didn't show, or if they're in the hospital, somebody from neurology wants a stat exam on it. So the in-between times, between, Mark, we're about to start your next pulse sequence. It's going to last 4.5 minutes. They're not twiddling their thumbs for the 4.5 minutes that part of the exam is going on. They're attending to 10 or 20 other things. They're sort of competing for their time and attention, right? As we increase throughput, we increase the number of things that are competing for their time and attention. Also, simultaneously, we have seen a marked increase in the levels of both patient acuity and implants, devices, and contraindications or complications at minimum that come with the patient to MRI. 25 years ago, all of the MRI manufacturers had these big, bold print legal statements in the operator's manual that essentially said, look, under no circumstances do you put any patient who has anything metal with them, in them, on them. You do not put that person inside this magnet. Or if you do, we are out. We take zero responsibility. Everything is on you, right? Then they came up with labeling or designation for implants and devices that have been tested and demonstrated to be safe in MRI environment, oftentimes with specific limiting sets of conditions, right? But the FDA said, you guys can't keep putting this disclaimer saying you do not allow any of these patients to be scanned when they have devices that we, the FDA, have said, yes, under that set of circumstances, it's okay to scan this patient.
Yeah.
So the manufacturers took those prohibitions out. Good friend of mine, Dr. Kanal, who is a neuroradiologist at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, he did a study of the UPMC MRI patients across all of their MRIs, so hospitals and outpatient imaging centers. And he found, I think the numbers were somewhere between 35 and 40% of all the MRI patients that get imaged in the UPMC system have implants, devices, shrapnel, foreign bodies, dermal piercings, tattoos, or other things that might represent meaningful complications from the safety perspective for the MRI patients.
Mhm.
So we have radically changed who our patient cohort is in MRI. So we have the economics that have not worked in the favor of MRI. In response to the economics, we have reduced workforce and increased throughput. And we also concurrently have this change in the makeup of our patient population. And the significant portion of the MRI patient population have these risks and complications and contraindications that didn't exist in the MRI patient population 25, 30 years ago. So all of these factors are sort of coming together as sort of perfect storm kind of set of circumstances to make the MRI safety environment more challenging today than it ever has been.
Yeah. So I got, I've done consulting with hospitals, but I'm going to wear the outsider to healthcare hat because I guess I can choose. And, last time I was doing consulting work regularly with a hospital, I walked through a magnetometer every day. It was in a large city. There are sadly shootings that occur, people bringing weapons into the emergency room or into the hospital. And, whether someone installing security, whether that's reactive or proactive, I don't think they're doing an ROI statement. They're probably just saying, well, this is a sad but necessary cost of doing business. I kind of would still just wonder that parallel of the staffing costs versus the risk of harm to staff, the risk of damage to the equipment.
Right.
Some of these incidents, it maybe at best throw the machine offline for a period of time, if not damage it.
Right.
It's an interesting set of trade-offs, even if someone were only strictly looking at financial trade-offs. I know, it's human nature. We don't do a good job of gauging risk,
Yeah.
known costs versus potential costs. That got more philosophical but it's just kind of, no, it is surprising that it seems so easy, for people to get metal close to the MRI. I guess I can let you react to that, but how many incidents are there a year in the US that cause harm or death, MRI mishaps?
Um, Death is very few. Death is, a very small number. Probably single digits in any given year. And keep in mind that in the US, historically, we've done around 30 million MRI studies per year. So, a handful of deaths, while almost all of them tend to be preventable through existing best practices,
Right.
and therefore, are in some ways kind of inexcusable. But in terms of gross numbers, we're not dealing with a particularly large number. I was joking the other day, and said to somebody, if my goal was to save more lives, I would probably better spend my time keeping people from tipping vending machines over on themselves to, get the chip bag that didn't come
Right.
out of the corkscrew dispenser or whatever, get angry and they wiggle the machine trying to get it out and it falls over on them and crushes them. More people die in the United States from vending machines tipping over on themselves than in MRI. So if you don't have a fear about going and getting,
Well,
candy bar out of the vending machine, you probably shouldn't have a fear of going into MRI.
right. But if I can just interject for a minute, when I lived in California, you get all kinds of warnings about attaching your furniture to the wall if it's tall and it could tip over. It seemed like vending machine makers or installers. I know they would say, well, you shouldn't be rattling the machine,
Right.
but it seems like that could be prevented. Human nature is people are going to rock the machine
Right.
to some
So
degree, right?
one of the important distinctions for me in terms of, people who die by tipping the vending machines over on themselves and people who are injured or die in an MRI environment is we all understand how gravity works, right? We are assuming some degree of autonomy and responsibility if we're going and shaking
Sure.
the vending machine, right?
And that's really more solely the result of one person's action.
Exactly, right. So in the
Yeah.
MRI environment, the the thing that makes me so enamored of MRI, the thing that makes me describe it as the closest thing to magic, is what makes it so difficult to understand from the patient's perspective, right? We don't expect the patient to understand, you know, you have ABC implant, of this particular variety implanted in this part of your body, and we're going to be imaging this other part of your body. And so therefore it is a risk or it isn't a risk, or we're going to modify the study in the following ways to manage those risks, or it would be grossly unfair to put a layperson in that position where they have to have responsibility over the decisions to keep them safe.
Sure.
So whereas the vending machine example, it's one person who's responsible beginning to end for the whole event. In an MRI environment, that is not the case. And the person who is most likely to be injured is the person who has the least knowledge and control over that situation, which in my mind transfers all of that responsibility onto the provider of the service of the care, right? That it's the hospital, the imaging center, the physician's office that needs to assume the responsibility for the whole enchilada, right? They are responsible for soup to nuts, everything associated with this episode of patient care, right? Yes, we turn to the patient, we have them fill out the screening form, and so we ask for information from the patient to inform that process. But the execution of that process and the responsibility for keeping the patient safe, falls with the institution and the individuals who are delivering care.
Right. Right.
One of the things that grinds my gears when we see accidents like if you go and you Google the woman who shot herself in the butt, because she brought her pistol into the MRI, you will see language used over and over again in depictions of that accident and other accidents where they talk about, it was a freak event, right? As if, God came down and pointed his finger at this particular patient care episode and created this. They're not freak events. They are not some sort of inescapable stochastic risk of dealing with patient care.
Right.
Do I believe that, if you make something idiot proof, they'll come up with better idiots? Yes, I do. I think human beings will continuously try and find new and inventive ways to circumvent processes, right? And we cannot anticipate all of the potential downstream responses to a risk mitigation step. Does that mean that we shouldn't take the risk mitigation step because we can't foresee all of the circumventions that somebody might take? Absolutely not.
Right.
So this idea that, this fatalistic, stuff's going to happen, is just that and the, it's a freak event that nobody could have anticipated. No, we anticipate these things all the time.
Right.
Both of those, the fatalistic and hand of God sort of explanations for this just absolutely make me crazy, right? But if you go back and you look at depictions in the popular and trade press about MRI accidents, and you remove any kind of framing or contextualization of hand of God or, fatalistic, well, this is just going to happen. You remove all of those references and you're really left with no choice but to scratch your head and go, well, if we know this can happen, why don't we prevent it from happening?
And before coming back to that real quick, I mean, the numbers around harm, I mean, are there dozens of incidents a year, roughly speaking, hundreds? And I'm sure there's underreporting, especially of near misses.
Right. So the US FDA has what's called the MDR, Medical Device Reporting Database. You and I, we can actually go online and we can view it. We can search it. It's called the MAUDE database, MAUDE. If you Google MAUDE FDA, it'll send you right to it.
Mm-hmm.
MAUDE is some horribly tortured acronym.
Yeah.
So the way that medical device reporting works in the United States is an accident happens at a point of care, right? And what if we don't kill the person at the point of care, then what's supposed to happen is the hospital or physician practice or imaging center is supposed to let the manufacturer of the MRI device know. And then the manufacturer of the device is supposed to report this to the FDA.
Hmm.
So if the site or the hospital, sort of sweeps it under the rug, if it's not something that we need to call in a service call, or even if it is something that we need to call in a service call to repair because we broke something important on the MRI, as long as we don't tell the service engineers that somebody was injured in that accident, then this vital link in the chain to share the information about the event doesn't happen. And the whole process is essentially short-circuited from at the very beginning, right? So a little over 10 years ago, Dr. Kanal, who I mentioned earlier, he and I did a research paper on how do MRI accidents occur? How do we prevent them? How comfortable are we in quantifying?
Mm-hmm.
To your specific question of are we dealing with tens or hundreds or whatever, in the FDA database, there are today probably on average between 150 and 200 MRI classified adverse events per year in the FDA database. So Dr. Kanal and I did an evaluation. State of Pennsylvania has mandatory adverse event reporting only for hospitals, but they collect the data from hospitals. Then they don't make it all public, but episodically they pick a special issue, a specific topic, and they will publish a year and a half's worth of reporting data on that topic. And so Pennsylvania had published, I think, 18 months of MRI adverse event reports that came into Pennsylvania Patient Safety Authority. We were like, this is a golden opportunity. We're going to compare adverse event reporting to the state of Pennsylvania, which is mandatory, against national reporting over the same time period. And the numbers in the state of Pennsylvania were 90% of the FDA's number for the entire year, for the entire country, right? So the Pennsylvania numbers only came from hospitals with mandatory reporting. And at that time, almost exactly 50% of MRI imaging was done in an outpatient setting. So we're like, okay, so if we take this number and double it, we're probably somewhere close to the actual number for the entire state of Pennsylvania across all providers. State of Pennsylvania was at the time roughly 5% of the US population. So if we population correct for that, so we multiply times 20, so we double it based on provider type, multiply times 20 for population correction to begin to get an estimate across the entire United States. When we did that, the US FDA number represents 2% of what the Pennsylvania data modeled out to a national level reflects, which would suggest that we're actually looking at somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 MRI adverse events in the United States in any given year. And over time, that number appears to be increasing. And not only is it increasing, but it also appears to be increasing at a substantially faster rate than we're growing MRI procedure volume.
Right.
So if MRI procedure volume is growing at 10% per annum, the accident rate is actually growing somewhere between 25 and 30% per annum.
Right.
So we are headed in the wrong direction.
Right. Um, I mean, there's a lot of connections to general, broader patient safety themes around underreporting of near misses and harms that seems to circumvent the opportunity to learn. I mean, aviation, while it's become very, very safe, I think because of, I'm generalizing, doing a better job of learning from past incidents very broadly, not repeating this incident in Japan will be learned from in ways that lead to system improvements, communication improvements. I'm much more confident about that than I am of the learning that might come from a widely reported healthcare safety incident. And so, there's some we advocate for broader mandatory non-punitive reporting, and that part there,
Yes.
the non-punitive part seems to be key. And then, there's the discussion around the numbers, and what grinds my gears is when you go off of estimates, sort of like you were walking us through here with MRI safety incidents. Healthcare doesn't report the real numbers, and then when clinicians and researchers do their best to estimate it, well, people poo-poo the estimates. Like, well, if you'd give us real numbers, but either way, whether it's 44,000 deaths a year or 440,000 deaths a year, when so many of these are preventable, any of those numbers are too high, and I don't want to be fatalistic of, well, what can we do about it? We got to keep answering that question. Sorry, end of speech. But I mean,
Well, to your point, the reporting mechanism that exists through the US FDA is not a patient safety reporting system. It is a regulatory compliance. Has this device that the FDA has approved, is the device causing more problems than we thought it was going to cause, right? It's a device-centric regulatory compliance mechanism.
Right.
It is not a patient safety mechanism.
Yeah. And the problem is not the device.
Right,
So there's this
exactly.
weird overlap of, we have these process problems to report.
Exactly. Where there may in fact be other, medical devices about which the FDA legitimately has concern, this device is a bad device, right? And we've all seen stories of things
Mhm.
along those lines. That historically has not been the case with MRI.
Right.
It is about the process. It is about point of care decision making and patient safety. So this reporting mechanism that we have, while it may be perfectly appropriate to sort of a regulatory compliance regime, it is, number one, not patient safety focused. And number two, even if it was, the information that it collects is so generified
Mm.
that it has no relevance really to MRI safety specifically. Some colleagues and I actually, we just launched this a handful of weeks ago. We developed an MRI specific adverse event reporting system. It's
Mm.
called CARE Reporting, CAIRE, reporting.org. And it is an MRI specific adverse event reporting structure. The idea being, if we do exactly what you described, what you were talking about with the Japanese Coast Guard crash, plane collision
Collision.
on the runway. If we act like the MRI safety NTSB, and we
Mhm.
collect the information, we digest it, we identify what the points of failure were, and then we share that information out in an anonymized fashion, right? This is not name and shame.
Right.
This is not about pointing fingers and laughing at individuals or organizations. This is the only way that we are collectively going to raise the floor is if we share information about how things go badly. And as long as there are all sorts of incentives to bury these things, the mechanisms that exist for reporting are, poor fits
Sure.
for MRI. We don't actually ask for the types of information that illuminate the unique hazard properties of MRI. As long as all of those things continue to be true, then we're never going to get the information that helps us QA/QC our ability to act safely in and around these, complicated, expensive, and clinically extraordinarily valuable pieces of equipment.
Right. Right. So Toby, maybe just one final question before we wrap up, and there's an endless list of other things I would love to ask you, but maybe I'll leave it just to one more question, or it's actually to ask for you to talk about something that's on your website that stands out to me, and I think there are strong parallels to lean thinking, especially when it comes to what the late Paul O'Neill, who was CEO of Alcoa and a healthcare safety advocate, talked about, false trade-offs. And, as you say on the website here, if you've been told that MRI safety only comes at the expense of throughput, you've been lied to. That we can have both safety and throughput, right?
Yes. And I was so waiting for an opportunity to circle back around to your very opening where you said we're probably not going to talk about lean, over the course of the conversation. This is the perfect bookend.
Okay.
Absolutely, lean is essential to MRI safety. Whether you call it lean or not, but you need to recognize that integrating safety practices, risk management practices, this is not just sort of slapping layers on a process.
Right.
Many sites do it that way, and I argue against that and suggest that that you're not helping yourself by doing that.
Right.
But by re-engineering the process so that you take into account and consideration the financial realities of where we are in MRI and what is the reimbursement, and we really can't afford to be offering services at a significant loss for the majority of our patients, right? So we need to recognize the financial realities. We need to look at, how do we maximize revenue? How do we effectively constrain costs while at the same time recognizing that there are risks, and risk management absolutely has to be a central part of designing or redesigning a process.
Yeah.
It is so easy to essentially come in with some sort of, checklist sticker that you slap on the wall and you always do these 12 things, right? If those 12 things don't recognize who the patients are, what the equipment is, what the clinical needs are, who the referring physicians are, what the reimbursement structure is, if you don't understand and embrace the entire operational model, and you just come in and superimpose these extra 12 things that folks are supposed to do, absolutely, that goes against the normal operations and the efficiencies or productivities that are built in. And that is sort of the worst example of risk assessment, risk management that is easy to implement, and yet the costs associated with implementing in that fashion are just astronomical.
Yeah.
When it comes to MRI, apart from patients not showing up or not showing up on time, the single biggest delay in throughput and productivity is MRI safety related questions or concerns. If we are smarter, if we have better processes for managing that 35 to 40% of the patient population that have some kind of complication or contraindication, right? One of those shows up at our doorstep and we don't have the training or the process to effectively manage it, our entire process, our entire throughput productivity is going to grind to a screeching halt until we figure out how to deal with this atypical, unusual, unanticipated patient condition, right? Which means all of the infrastructure, all of the capital investment is now just sort of sitting idle and costing us money, right? Whereas if you have effective processes, if you have effectively trained individuals at the point of care, managing patient care, and you look at that situation and you're like, I know exactly what to do in that situation, right? Now, all of a sudden, there is no delay. If sites actually quantified how much delay, how much drag there is on their throughput and productivity, strictly because of MRI safety questions, and then extrapolated out what the cost of that missing patient care time is over the course of a quarter, a year, the 10-year lifespan of an MRI scanner, those costs are exorbitant. I mean, the amount of money that sites lose on a given year simply because they don't have smart and effective integrated processes for safety sort of built into the way that they operate. It is the idea that we're only going to improve safety at the cost of productivity or throughput is so backwards to the average state of the average, MRI provider in the United States. Almost always, I can go into a site, improve safety, and improve their productivity and throughput. And when you look at what the economic implications of that are over a significant chunk of time, it's huge.
Yes. And I think if a team is still doing this work in a way where the safety steps are slowing down throughput, that just means we haven't figured out how to do it the better way yet.
Right.
And, I think whether it's Paul O'Neill or a quote unquote lean sensei would challenge people to say, well, don't say it can't be done in a way that breaks the trade-off. You just haven't figured it out yet. Not to be Pollyanna about things, but that's the challenge. You have to figure it out and be creative and redesign things instead of just adding triple checks on top of things. And just kind of final thought that comes to mind, John Grout, who's a professor who studied Toyota, and he's in particular an expert on mistake proofing, and he's published a great book. It's available free through AHRQ on mistaking healthcare, and he says quite definitively, good mistake proofing doesn't slow down the process.
Right.
And it's very possible to have good mistake proofing that doesn't slow you down. So I think hopefully that provides some inspiration to somebody to kind of get past that assumed it always has to be this way trade-off.
Yes. Yeah. Because yes, there probably are discrete things that, should get introduced that might have sort of a slowing contribution to the overall process. But that's one thing that might add a little bit of a slow, for an effective risk management result. But that one thing that slows things down is usually going to be coupled with 5, 6, 8, 10 things that are going to cut steps out or cut delays out, and allow for the care for more patients, the more effective and efficient way to get patients through. So many hospitals today are just absolutely hung up on their Press Ganey, patient satisfaction scores. How satisfied do you think the patient is when they take off from work and they show up for their exam and you tell them, oh, I'm sorry, we can't do it because we don't have the information that allows us to do the risk assessment, right?
Right.
So you're shooting yourself in the foot 6 different ways when you don't effectively manage these patients with the complications and contraindications. You're not making use of your personnel. You're not, utilizing the capital equipment. You're aggravating the patients. You're aggravating the referring physicians. All of these things. You improve the process, which should innately include the safety aspects of it. And you're going to improve all of those things because inefficiency in the way we handle safety is such a point of friction in patient care in MRI today.
Well, Toby, I want to thank you for the work that you're doing to shed light on the issue and to help people in MRI settings, hospitals, and otherwise, improve safety for all. And I want to thank you for being here today. I feel like this is a very rich topic. I feel like we just scratched the surface a little bit, but I would encourage the listener to follow Toby on LinkedIn, Tobias Gilk. You can find him there. Go check out his website. There'll be a link in the show notes. Thank you. I just want to thank you for agreeing to do the conversation here today. This has really been enlightening.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.